I think I've always, in my working life in 30 years, I've always been in organizations where I've been explaining the broader world of politics to a bigger group of people or explaining the interests of a bigger group of people to political institutions. And so there is a sort of fundamental reliance there on rules. Politics works by rules. The EU, which I worked in for a long time, is a organization based entirely on treaties. So fundamentally, law is important. Not that I'm a lawyer in any shape or form, but the you know basic and shared standards, I think, are what keep things ticking over. And the fundamental one of those is human rights. I mean, obviously, for most of human history, the individual rights of humans haven't been understood or recognized. People wouldn't ever see it as something that was important to them. But I think with as we move away, or at least in parts of the West, we move away from a kind of unquestioning sense of religious belief where you let other people take the decisions and set the rules for you, then understanding what are fundamental rights the world over are it seems to me to be increasingly important. And yeah, I think I've worked in education, I've worked for the EU, I've worked in all sorts of things like that, and in all of them, it's basically there's an element of respect that is central, and you can't really have respect unless you know what a lack of respect looks like.
So, starting with our first question, human rights are a way of describing the universal character of humanity. At present, many people don't relate to this. Fear, division, and lack of knowledge get in the way. Why do you think that is?
I think I think it depends who you speak to, and I think where you speak to them. So it depends what their experience of the state's involvement in their own life is, or if the state is absent from their own life. Um, but also it depends on their daily life. If the economic pressures on them, say, are great and heavy, then it's perhaps not surprising that people, in some ways, subjugate their own personal concerns and their own rights to just getting on. Um, but a lot of it is to do with whether you feel challenged or not. I mean, I am conscious to use the stereotype. I'm a pale, stale male. I'm married with two children. I live in the United Kingdom. It couldn't be more straightforward. So how many times have I genuinely felt that my human rights have been either curtailed or challenged? They have at times, but never in a way that's kept me awake at night, except possibly my work to try and prevent the Brexit result. But I've married somebody from a country in South America where those things are real and actively concerned. Um, uh, and I'm conscious that people within half a mile of me are people who do feel that their rights are infringed, whether it's aspects of identity, gender, sexuality, race, socioeconomic, whatever. So I think in the most basic sense, at least speaking at it from my perspective, it's just these things only matter when their loss or their absence is greater than the other concerns in your daily life, or is the source of your greater concerns. And people may think they don't come across these things, but think of every time you've been irritated by questions at a border, you know, with your passport, or you had to queue for hours to do that kind of stuff, or you've been stopped by a policeman in a check, which you think is a little unfair. You weren't speeding, or you were trying to get somewhere important, or a lot of people consider themselves to be terribly law-abiding until suddenly they feel that the law is acting against them. So yeah, I think life right now feels difficult for people, and therefore I can understand why they would subjugate aspects of their personal concern. But I do think the two are completely incompatible.
Can you offer some immediate practical steps to help people recognize that their human rights, that their own human rights and the rights of others, and that they are in fact human rights that are universal, that they are overall universal?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this recently in terms of football and the incredible diversity of the countries playing in the World Cup and the experience of those individuals. Never mind the experience that a lot of those individuals are feeling simply going to watch the football and their human rights may be being questioned. Um, and I suppose one way would be to consider how the laws and actions of other countries would affect you if you were them. Increasingly in this globalized world, we know a lot more people from a lot more countries than we ever would have done, than my parents' generation ever would have done. So put yourself in the situation of any one of them um, who may prioritize aspects of their rights differently. They may put some above others, they may think some are less important, and just see how you would feel about that. And see what they feel about your sense of importance and priority. Um, I think it's harder when you do it domestically because ultimately you see where you fit into society and it's harder to do it. But I think if you thought of yourself in the same situation, doing the same job, living the same life, but doing it in five different countries, and think how different would that experience be in each of them? That's probably the best way I think in the modern world to do it.
Our understanding of human rights adapts to the condition of the world at any time. How would you describe the evolution of human rights over the past 75 years?
I mean, I think we probably, and again, it's difficult to separate the perspective from sitting in Edinburgh to globally, but I think there's been a shift away from states establishing rights to individuals owning rights, perhaps. So we are far from being done in terms of states accepting the core principles of the convention or whatever it might be, even within Europe itself. But there is even in the more fervent aspects of politics on the fringes, which we're all experiencing these days, you don't get many people going, human rights is a pile of nonsense. Generally they don't, because they know deep down that even they have human rights that they wouldn't want to infringe. You get different emphases, family rights as opposed to individual rights or this kind of stuff, rule of law, all of that kind of thing. But I think probably we've moved, at least in my experience, from expressing your human rights as relates to the state and institutions that might somehow curb them or deny them or limit them or redefine them to you defining them yourself within the context of your life. So, you know, this is who I am, therefore these are the rights I understand, and I expect people to observe them. And I think that's probably it's a different emphasis. And I think that's probably why you get in my mind, completely unnecessary arguments in domestic politics about things like gender identity. When in fact you're talking about well-being, you're talking about safeguarding, you're talking about people's welfare. You're not talking about political positioning. So the more people express more individual versions of their own rights, then the more other people are going to feel that that somehow infringes on them because it's not what they believe. Um, so I think that more individual element is probably the biggest change. But it's easy to say that because we think, well, because the pressures that created the original convention have far gone. Well, they haven't. We have have one hot war in Europe and a couple of cold ones, and on the fringes of Europe, in almost every direction, certainly north, certainly east, and certainly south. You know, rights are being challenged all this time in the way they were up until 1945. So it's never as far away as we think it's going to be. But I think that's probably the biggest gap at the moment.
And sort of in relation to that point, what do you think we can learn from pioneers of modern human rights after the Second World War?
Yeah, I think be bold. I mean, the easiest thing, I guess, to do after the war, um, even with forward-thinking lawyers like Maxwell Fyfe, would have been to say, well, let's just rebuild. Let's get ourselves back on track. Let's get the economy going. Let's get people back to work and this kind of stuff. And hope that in some ways the prosperity that might come from that would rein in the more revolting tendencies that the war had exposed. But clearly that didn't work in 1918. Clearly that didn't work in 1870. Clearly that didn't work in 1815. And back you go. So I think the boldness of saying, no, actually, it doesn't have to be like this. And there are some basic truths, which after all is something that the Americans had said 250 years ago today, or yet tomorrow. It's to a certain extent, it's things we'd said in the Bill of Rights and Magna Carta and, take your pick. And so I think that boldness and that separation from, country dynamics to a sort of higher cause is, is hugely instructive and as necessary as ever because, as Britain is finding, being a country that claims to have a sense of itself isn't enough and isn't necessarily enough for the protection of its own people, never mind anybody else's. So I think that, I mean, it was Hillary Clinton or somebody said you should always take advantage of a crisis. There can be no greater crisis than the Second World War. So in that respect, to step forward and say, in a way, if you think what the fan, what the authors of ECHR did, it's quite similar to what Jean Monnet tried to do in a European sense. They tried to make war materially impossible by respecting everybody's rights and therefore saying you should not ever be able to do this again. Monet tried to make it materially impossible by simply saying you're not going to be able to do this because your coal and steel are going to be in super governmental hands. And it's the same kind of thing. And and that kind of thinking had never really played out before. Even after 1918, even after 1870, people just went, right, well, let's change the balance of power a bit and give wee bits of land to different people. Nobody thought, hang on, are we doing this whole thing the wrong way around? So I think that's it. The other thing I would say, and this is true of Maxwell Fyfe as anybody, is don't assume people's political positions demonstrate a fixed view of the world. Because if you look at his career as Home Secretary, in modern terms, it would be seen as, at least centre right, in terms of the domestic issues. But that doesn't make any difference to what he believed and he enacted in his work more broadly. And so there is an assumption, I think, because of politics being so divisive now, that somehow if you agree with somebody on one thing, you must disagree with them on everything. And that's clearly not the case. And it took people with very, very different views on a lot of things to work together to make these things work, just as it did in the European sense. I mean, people of my father's generation who had faced each other, slightly older than my father, over the battlefield, were working together 20 years later.
So, turning our mind to the future, what would be your principal objectives for a programme to educate future generations in human rights?
In this respect, I would individualize it, get people to chart their ordinary life, the life of their family, um, or their aspirant life if they're students. And, this is what I've done, this is what I'm going, this is what I expect from school, university, work, whatever, and this is where I hope I end up. And then just and break that down into all the points of inflection where these things are not taken for granted. And your assumptions on doing that are assumptions that come from people having put rules in place and common standards in place. This doesn't just happen automatically. I think that's in my mind, that would probably be the most effective way. In the same way, when I used to talk about the EU, there's no point in talking about grand principles when you're trying to talk to a group of people. Talk about how it affects their daily life. So if you can look at your life and say, well, your parents' access to healthcare and maternity care, your rights access to nursery, your access to school, your possible access to university, or your respect in the workplace. All of these things are not accidental. Um, so that would probably be my approach. I think show what's changed and also show what's not present in certain other places. Every one of those landmark things, you can come up with 5, 10 examples of places where that is not given, or not understood, or not prioritized. And it's, what better way to understand what you have got than to recognize people who you respect don't have.
So, as our final question, could we do more to secure human rights? What is the single most important thing that could be done to ensure human rights are secured?
I think stress the human rather than the rights, if you see what I mean. There's a lot of political invective which gets in the way because people say, oh, rights, they've been taken too far, or they've been used in the wrong way. I mean, just look at the discussion about the ECHR and migration and these sorts of things in Britain. Total misrepresentation of both the principle and indeed the reality of how many times the United Kingdom ever lose a case in Strasbourg or on appeal or whatever. But actually, I think given the parallel obsession at the moment about things like AI and the new workplace and stuff, stress the human bit. These are rights because you're human. You're not human because you have rights, because animals have rights. In some aspects of the world, rivers now have rights. You know, um, so what is it that, as we're thinking about AI, what is it that makes us human, and why does that automatically, in some way, present itself as rights? Ultimately it's the ability to think, it's the ability to make decisions. And how can you respect the situation that people get into where, with the same education and the same background, possibly the same parents, their brain works in two different ways? And how do you respect that? Because you can't make a hierarchy between them. So it's the humanity of it that I think is the important bit. It's almost, and I don't mean this in the wrong way, but it's almost more important than the rights bit. If you think now of how we maybe need to speak to future generations in terms of careers, and not that people are going to have kind of single careers, I think, what's going to make the difference, whether or not AI is as dominant as people say it is or not, is what makes them human. Because that's what distinguishes you from all these other clever systems in place. You can speak languages through AI, but that there's a humanity to language that doesn't come from AI. And I think that's probably, in a broader sense, what matters. Why is, what distinguishes, nobody will go around, and this is going to sound absurd, but stick with me, nobody would go up to Rwanda and start putting gorillas in cages because they treated the rest of their family badly. Nobody would pick up tiger cubs, I mean lion cubs in Africa, and lock up the mother because the mother had rejected them. We would go, that's nature. That's the way things are. Like every time people get squeamish on a David Attenborough program when something kills something else, including of its own species. So there's a human thing that is entirely different, and that's the bit we need to stress, because ultimately what prompted the work that your ancestors did, it was to operate in the absence of humanity. It was when humanity departed that things went so horribly wrong. And it was, you either had industrialized killing, which took the humanity out of it, or you had identity killing, which took the personal sense of being out of it. And so therefore that's the bit you've desperately got to hang on to.